Some years ago, I found myself on vacation with my family in Sydney, Australia, at a moment when the entire country, indeed the entire continent, was gripped with the most critical question of the age. What would be the name of the royal baby, the first child just born to Prince William and Princess Kate of England? This was not, I confess, an issue over which I had lost too much sleep. And so one morning, as I sat in the hotel lounge enjoying my coffee, overlooking the stunning vista of Sydney's harbour, I paid little attention to the TV that was on in the background, on which the anchors were pondering the possibilities. Edward, Charles, George. Then suddenly one anchor suggested, "What about David as a name?" And the other anchor instantly replied, "What kind of a name for a king is David?" So surprised was I at this exclamation that I started in my seat, and to this day it is imprinted on my mind. I cannot wonder whether I misheard. Did a member of the media actually just say that? But the truth is that the journalist was touching on something very interesting. The striking fact is that whereas much about the coronation ritual of English kings is actually inspired by the tales of the Davidic dynasty, and while there were, a good 900 years ago, Scottish monarchs named David, nevertheless, not a single English king was known by this name as they ruled from the throne. And only one of them over 1,000 years even had a connection to this appellation. And this one king was the uncle of the current Queen Elizabeth, the abdicated king that we have come to know from the crown, who was after birth baptized Edward, Albert, Christian, George, Andrew, Patrick, David. That was his succinct name. And even though he was known as David to his close friends, upon ascending the throne for some 11 months, he immediately took the regnal name Edward VIII. For what kind of a name for a king is David? And yet, for Jews, there is no better name for a king, for no other individual is so eternally affiliated with monarchy. For us, David is the political ruler par excellence. And this can be found first and foremost in the fact that in Jewish parlance, David is always known as David HaMelech, David the king. This is an honorific always added to his name. He reigns supreme, in other words, in the annals of Jewish statesmanship. It can be said that in being accorded this extraordinary appellation, David joins two other individuals in Jewish history, Abraham and Moses. Abraham for Jews is always Avraham Avinu, Abraham our father, indicating that he is the supreme symbol of Jewish family. Moses is eternally Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses our master or teacher, in order to indicate that he is the supreme proclaimer of the Jewish faith. And David is always king, because if we wish to learn about statesmanship from a Jewish perspective, we must first and foremost study his life and legend. And what a legend he was. A stripling propelled to military fame by his victory over Goliath, David is then targeted by King Saul as a potential rival. David survives and ultimately succeeds Saul. Upon being crowned king, David then further makes manifest his military brilliance by taking Jerusalem from the Jebusites, a city for centuries considered unconquerable. And he bequeaths to the next generation his vision of a temple to God crowning his capital. So quintessentially regal is he in the Jewish imagination, so synonymous with statesmanship and with monarchical magnificence, that every Jewish child in a traditional school is taught to exultantly sing 5 words that embody our adulation. David Melech Yisrael Chai V'Kayam. David, King of Israel, lives and endures. And yet, when we consider it, we realize that it is a bit odd that David is bestowed this honor, David the king, as Abraham and Moses are bestowed the honor of father and teacher. Abraham is Avinu, Abraham is our father, the immortality of Abraham, Abraham is our father because the immortality of Abraham is evident at every circumcision. When a Jewish father emotionally enunciates his obligation at the ritual, as lahachniso brivito shel Avraham Avinu, to escort his child into the covenant of Abraham, our ancestor. Moses is Rabbeinu, our master, because his immortality is equally evident. As Leon Cass noted in this past week's Wall Street Journal, even a secular thinker such as Rousseau marveled in the 18th century how, quote, the Jews provide us with an astonishing spectacle. The laws of Greek and Roman lawgivers are dead. The very much older laws of Moses are still alive. So Abraham is always Avinu, our father, because his family endured. Moses is always Rabbeinu, our teacher, because his faith endured. But in what sense is David always, eternally, perpetually, king of Israel? David's son Solomon does indeed erect the temple of David's dream. But 10 out of 12 tribes secede after Solomon's death. And for the next several centuries, David's own dynasty rules over southern Israel only. After the destruction of Jerusalem by Babylonia, no descendant of David sits again upon the throne of Israel. The Jewish monarchy, when it rules, is led by the priestly Hasmonean house. And then, for many centuries, before disappearing, the Davidic dynasty lives on only in certain smaller political positions recognized by the rabbis, such as Nasi, patriarch in the Holy Land, or Reish Galuta, exilarch in the diaspora. But as a royal ruling family, it endures only as messianic hope. So the achievements in family of Abraham are obvious. The achievements in faith of Moses are manifest. But what do we mean when we proudly proclaim that David, king of Israel, lives? In addressing this enigma, we must, in the opening lecture of this series on Jewish statesmanship, simultaneously seek to understand what a true statesman actually is, and also what we mean when we speak of excellence in Jewish statesmanship. Only then can we comprehend the complexity and the immortality of the man who remains king of Israel millennia after he lived. In 1944, a young man by the name of Isaiah Berlin was working for English intelligence in the British Embassy in Washington, D.C. The Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, could sense the brilliance of the writer who wrote these reports, and he yearned to get the opportunity to meet this mysterious Mr. Berlin in person, to talk politics, the war, and much else. Then, in May of 44, London was visited not by Isaiah Berlin, but by Irving Berlin, the American songwriter. Churchill happened to hear from his wife Clementine that a Mr. Berlin was in town, and he insisted on meeting this brilliant man whose political analyses he had so enjoyed. And so, in a situation more suitable for a sitcom, Irving Berlin went to lunch with the world's greatest statesman, who had unfortunately assumed that his guest had a similarly remarkable political mind. And I believe this is from Irving Berlin's own recollection of this event, it unfolded as follows. Mr. Berlin, Churchill asked, thinking that he was speaking to Isaiah Berlin, what is the most important piece of work you have done for us lately, in your opinion? Poor Irving Berlin hesitated, a bit unsure about what was being asked, and then he answered hesitantly, I don't know, it would be White Christmas, I guess. No doubt at this point flummoxed, Churchill asked, do you think Roosevelt will be re-elected this year? And Berlin said, well, in the past I have voted for him myself, but this year I'm not so sure. Now Churchill is utterly mystified, but he makes one last stab, and he says, Mr. Berlin, when do you think the European war is going to end? And Berlin responded, Sir, I shall never forget this moment. When I go back to my own country, I shall tell my children and my children's children that in the spring of 1944, the Prime Minister of Great Britain asked me when the European war was going to end. That was it for Churchill. Poor Irving Berlin went back from his lunch to his hotel, and he reflected to an acquaintance, you know, Mr. Churchill is probably the greatest man in England, or in the world maybe. But I don't know what it was. I somehow felt we did not click. I don't know what it was. Meanwhile, Churchill commented to his own staff, Berlin's just like most bureaucrats. Wonderful on paper, but disappointing when you meet him face to face. This amusing anecdote is also enormously instructive. Churchill here implicitly offers us a distinction between the bureaucrat and the statesman. One is impressive on paper, the other inspires in person. The bureaucrat is all rules and regulations. The statesman overwhelms with his or her personality. The bureaucrat is concerned with what is. The statesman impresses us with a sense of vision, not only of what is, but what is yet to be. Bureaucrats perform solely based on social, external expectations, but a statesman's achievements are an extension of their very selves. Statesmanship literally refers, technically, to engagement in the affairs of state, but bureaucrats also engage in political matters, and this indicates that the word statesmanship symbolizes something higher, something linked to a leader's unique creative capacity and particular personality. And the fascinating fact is that this point was made by the very man that Churchill had originally intended to meet. As Isaiah Berlin ultimately became one of the most significant political theorists of our time, he ultimately wrote an essay that was titled On Political Judgment, in which he noted that while we tend to bandy around the term political science as if it actually those who lead or engage in affairs of state obey universal rules, the truth is that truly great leaders often decide what to do by drawing on a certain unique strength within themselves. In Berlin's words, political judgment is, quote, a capacity in the first place for synthesis rather than analysis, for knowledge in the sense in which conductors know their orchestras as opposed to that in which chemists know the contents of their test tubes or mathematicians know the rules that their symbols obey. That's part of the quote of what Berlin says. In other words, Berlin is saying that leadership is an art rather than a science. It reveals the inner genius of those who lead. And this is, I think, what Bismarck meant when he admiringly said of Benjamin Disraeli's achievements at the Congress of Berlin, Der alte Jude, ist der Mann. That old Jew, he's the man. It is here that we can begin to understand the unique problem that presents itself from a Jewish perspective. Political achievements reflect the greatness of the statesman's very self. And yet at the heart of Judaism is the claim that ultimately the endurance and the salvation of the Jewish people is not only the result of statesmanship, but also, and indeed primarily, of providence. That the history of the nation of Israel throughout the ages reflects not only political genius, but also the wonder that is Jewish chosenness. For Judaism, while statesmanship is essential, there remains something about the salvation, redemption, and eternity of Israel that cannot be only chalked up to the choices made by leaders. And indeed, part of the role of the leader or the statesman is to inspire all Israel to appreciate that. The salvation of the Jewish people is meant to provoke Israel to exclaim gratitude and proclaim gratitude to the God of Israel, not to merely say, Der alte Jude, ist der Mann. And what this means is that the Jewish statesman at his or her most excellent is asked to do something that is extraordinarily difficult. The Jewish statesman must illustrate the political genius and artistry that we have just described, but simultaneously see in these actions not only human achievement, but also providence. The truly Jewish statesman must have awe-inspiring achievements, but must also seek to ensure that the awe that it inspires is directed not at the statesman himself, but at the God of Israel. The great Jewish statesman moves Israel's history forward while reminding the Jewish people that it is in the history of the Jewish people that God himself is revealed, that providence makes itself known. This complex, delicate dialectic was given eloquent expression by the essayist Milton Himmelfarb in his written reflection immediately following the Six-Day War. Himmelfarb wrote in part as follows, quote, Each Jew knows how thoroughly ordinary he is, yet taken together we seem caught up in things great and inexplicable. It is almost, Himmelfarb writes, it is almost as if we were not acting, but being acted through. The number of Jews in the world, writes Himmelfarb, is smaller than a small statistical error in the Chinese census. Yet, we remain bigger than our numbers. Big things seem to happen around us and to us. It's a striking quote, especially considering when it was written, because from one perspective, the 67 war was the ultimate embodiment not of Jewish ordinariness, but of Israeli military genius. A preemptive strike, the disabling of the entire Egyptian Air Force, one of the most extraordinary achievements in the entire history of war. And yet, Himmelfarb understood that precisely in these wondrous victories, the hand of God could be seen. That the Jews needed to be understood as both actors and also providentially acted upon. Should Jewish achievements, should one small people's outsized impact on the world, as it outlived all its enemies, be seen as a triumph of the human will or as a miracle? Are Jews the primary actors in the story, or are they acted upon? The answer for Judaism is both, and it is the obligation of the statesman to help all he leads to see that. So to adopt a Jewish approach to statesmanship is to embrace a dialectic. One is obligated simultaneously to believe that, to paraphrase Isaiah Berlin, on the one hand, great statesmen conduct history the way maestros conduct their orchestra, and for the Bible this is an aptitude to be admired. And yet, on the other hand, for the Jewish statesman, this awareness must be combined with a recognition that there is something bigger, someone much greater than the statesman who is the true conductor of history. It is here that David, more than anyone else in the Bible, excelled. It was David that at moments of his greatest genius may have been expected to extend all acclaim to himself, and instead ascribes the achievement entirely to the miraculous relation of love between the Almighty and the people of Israel. We see this first and foremost in his rise to greatness, his first military achievement. Let us review. The Philistines gather, led by their champion, the gargantuan Goliath. Saul seeks someone to face him. All are afraid. David steps forward, superficially a stripling, a shepherd boy, spoiling for a fight. When Saul voices skepticism at David's military abilities, David replies in defiance that he has bested many a mighty adversary on the field of battle. He says to Saul, "Thy servant kept his father's sheep, and there came a lion and a bear and took a lamb out of the flock. Thy servant slew both the lion and the bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be as one of them." So David appears superficially to embody arrogance, confidence, braggadocio. Yet David says more, allowing us to understand that in fact his entire approach to victory is different. David adds, "The God who saved me from the lion and the bear, he will save me from this Philistine." Because David explains, this Philistine has scorned the armies of the living God. A shot of David's sling downs the giant. But in facing him, David draws confidence not from his own abilities, but from his faith, declaring to the giant, "Thou comest to me with a sword and with a spear and with a javelin, but I come to thee in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel." This moment is a microcosm of David's greatness. The stand against Goliath provides a prism through which to study his entire life, his entire reign. And the essence of David's achievement in this episode is not often understood. Malcolm Gladwell, in his celebrated essay and then book on David and Goliath, insists that the central lesson of this story is that any gifted strategist can turn disadvantage into advantage, and that David is a gifted strategist. Seemingly, for his approach, nothing more. Gladwell writes, quote, "David's victory over Goliath in the biblical account is held to be an anomaly. It was not. David's win all the time. The political scientist Ivan Aragon-Toft," writes Gladwell, "recently looked at every war fought in the past 200 years between strong and weak combatants. The Goliaths, he found, won in 71.5% of the cases. That," Gladwell continues, "is a remarkable fact. Aragon-Toft was analyzing conflicts in which one side was at least 10 times as powerful in terms of arm, might, and population as its opponent, and even in those lopsided contests, the underdog won almost a third of the time." End quote. And Gladwell thus studies the biblical story and deduces how David is employing a brilliant strategy. So, in other words, to expand on this point, David eschews any armor in facing Goliath, and this allowed him to act with a speed and quickness with which Goliath, girded in unwieldy armor, could not compete. Utilizing a sling, David targeted the opponent's forehead, the one part of the body that was unprotected. He noted a vulnerability that may have been overseen by others. So, act in unexpected ways, use speed in targeting weaknesses of your powerful opponent. In David's stand against Goliath, for Gladwell, we see the makings of a military genius, one who's crafty and unconventional, and therefore can win not only once, but throughout his life. And Gladwell is right in some respect, but to stress this is to miss the meaning of the episode. Of course, David here employs his remarkable mind in order to achieve victory. And of course, we encounter in this young man the makings of a monarch. Nowhere does the Bible say that David's victory over Goliath is an anomaly. And of course, the episode indicates the genius that David will make manifest as king. But the miracle, ladies and gentlemen, in David's life is that he ascribes these achievements to God when the temptation to do otherwise must have been enormous. David understands and channels his own genius, but God always gets the credit, not him. And his victory is always seen by him as another sign of Israel's remarkable endurance. The God who saved me from the lion and from the bear, he will save me from the Philistine. For he has besmirched the forces of the living God. That humility of David for the Bible and for all of us, the humility that this brilliant warrior and leader shows, that is the anomaly. I once asked my friend, the historian Andrew Roberts, author of a magisterial Churchill biography, if there were any great European statesmen who were known for their humility. He did not name one. For most truly great statesmen, it's precisely a celebration of themselves in part, a delight in being, or certainly a delight in being in charge, that is the source of their strength. That is often the source of the greatness they make manifest. In his own memoirs, Churchill describes his state of mind when he is finally appointed prime minister by the king. This was the most daunting moment in English history. France is falling. The Nazis have swept the continent. America and the Soviet Union are not yet in the war. And yet, Churchill writes, quote, describing that moment, I cannot conceal from the reader of this truthful account a profound sense of relief. At last, I had the authority to give directions over the whole scene. I felt, wrote Churchill, as if I were walking with destiny and that all my past life had been but a preparation for this hour and for this trial. I thought I knew a good deal about it all, and I was sure I should not fail. Therefore, wrote Churchill, although impatient for the morning, I slept soundly and had no need for cheering dreams. Facts are better than dreams, end quote. The reader of the memoir is immediately overwhelmed by Churchill's sense of confidence in himself. And confidence is a character trait that David had as well, but the overwhelming sense of humility in the face of God's providence that David eternally exhibits, that's lacking here in this account. Churchill did indeed believe in destiny and he believed in God, but as Andrew once put it, in Churchill's theology, God's job seemed mainly to be safeguarding the well-being of Winston Churchill. Now, do we begrudge Churchill his self-confidence, his delight in being in control, his seeming belief that his very will could win the war? I say this, ladies and gentlemen, not in criticism of Churchill, whose example never ceases to inspire, but rather as a form of contrast. And it's quite clear that in Churchill's case, his own confidence in himself allowed him to be a bulwark in the face of the impotence of Chamberlain and much of the free world facing Hitler at the time. William Manchester's biography of Churchill reports that once, when in an argument with his butler, Churchill commented, "You were very rude to me." And the servant said in reply, "You were very rude to me as well." And Churchill said, "Yes, but I am a great man." Now we hear such stories and we instinctively laugh. But Manchester fascinatingly notes that the servant, in recounting this episode and how Churchill said to him, "Yes, but I am a great man," the servant added, there was no answer to that. He knew, as I and the rest of the world knew, that he was right. He was right. Churchill was a great man and he himself knew it. But David is different. As David becomes king, as he defends Israel against its enemies, as he helps form his nation for the first time into what will become a superpower, one of the few moments in Jewish history when it actually is a superpower. David, too, like Churchill, offers us a window into his mind again and again, because it is in the Psalms that we discover David's self. And we find therein a balance between majesty and extraordinary humility again and again. One exquisite example is just a selection of verses that I'm taking from Psalm 18. The Lord is my rock and my fortress and my deliverer, my God, my strength in whom I will trust, my buckler, the horn of my salvation, my high tower. For thou wilt save the afflicted people, meaning God. For by thee, God, I have run through a troop, and by my God I have leapt over a wall. It is God that girdeth me with strength and maketh my way perfect. Think about these verses, and there are so many more like them in the Psalms. Is David here the actor, the warrior, or is it God? In this Psalm's descriptions of his battles, his victories, his military exploits, and his fantastic feats, is David subject or object? The answer, of course, is he is both. That dialectic is the very theme of the psalm. The well-being of the Jewish people is in David's hands, but he and they are in the hands of God. Is he a great warrior statesman, or is he a humble servant? He is both. David describes how he attacks a troop, how he runs through them, how he leaps a wall. But nevertheless, thou, God, David proclaims, thou, God, will save the afflicted people. David, upon achieving victory, engages in Jewish statesmanship precisely because he seeks no celebration of the self, and rather seeks to inspire an understanding by Israel and the world of the miracle that is the Jewish people. To use Himmelfarb's phrase, David is both actor and acted upon. Natan Sharansky describes his discovery of King David while in prison, when his wife, Avital, gave him a book of Psalms. And he writes in his autobiography how in the personality of this man, David, he, Sharansky, learned to fear no evil in the shadow of death. Sharansky writes that as a child, the only Jewish image in his childhood home was of David defeating Goliath. Now, he writes, in my cell, King David had come to my aid. But as Sharansky discovered, the David of the Psalms was not only a warrior. As Sharansky put it, quote, King David now appeared before me, not as a fabled hero or a mystical Superman, but as a live, indomitable soul. Sharansky writes that David was, quote, daring and resolute, but in order to be bold in combat with his enemies, he had to be humble before the Lord, end quote. Herein, in all his complexity, we discover David's true excellence as a statesman and his uniqueness as a Jewish statesman. Isaiah Berlin, in another, even more famous essay, divided statesmen, writers, thinkers, leaders, maybe everyone, into two categories, foxes and hedgehogs, in the spirit of the saying, the fox knows many things, but the hedgehog knows one big thing. Hedgehogs, for Berlin, as he writes, quote, relate everything to a single central vision, end quote. And foxes respond differently to diverse situations. It is perhaps the most famous essay of Berlin's career. As John Lewis Gaddis writes in his book On Grand Strategy, long before the internet, this essay by Berlin went viral. Quote, you had to be one or the other, Berlin seemed to be saying. You couldn't be both and be happy, or effective, or even whole. Berlin was therefore surprised but puckishly pleased, writes Gaddis, when his creatures, the fox and the hedgehog, went viral, long before there was an internet to help them along. References began proliferating in print. Cartoons appeared, requiring no explanation. And, writes Gaddis, in university classrooms, professors began asking their students, was X, who could be any historical or literary figure, a fox or a hedgehog? End quote. But the problem, as Gaddis notes, is that the choice presented by this essay is wrong. Because the truth is that truly great statesmen are simultaneously hedgehogs and foxes. Like foxes, they innovate in the face of the uniqueness of the situation, but truly great statesmen simultaneously never lose sight of a central principle in their life. The greatest of statesmen combine both a compelling, defining moral vision with the craftiness required to address the challenges, the unique challenges that present themselves, as the statesman seeks to achieve this vision. For Gaddis, this point is best made by the Steven Spielberg movie Lincoln, where Lincoln tells Thaddeus Stevens that while he, like Stevens, also opposes slavery and wishes to end it, he also has the political skill to maneuver toward actually achieving the abolition of slavery. In the film, Lincoln refers to a lesson that he learned while working as a surveyor. He said to Stevens, quote, a compass will point you true north from where you're standing, but it's got no advice about the swamps and deserts and chasms that you'll encounter along the way. If, Lincoln says in the film, if in pursuit of your destination you plunge ahead, heedless of obstacles, and achieve nothing more than to sink in a swamp, then what's the use of knowing true north? End quote. And Gaddis writes that when he was sitting in the theater and he saw this, he immediately thought of Berlin, and he said something like, he wrote that he felt that Berlin was sitting right next to him, and he felt like saying to Berlin, see, did you see that movie? You have to be both a fox and a hedgehog. Meaning, Lincoln was a hedgehog. He knew one big thing. His true north was the proposition that all men are created equal. But he was also a fox, seizing his moments, the precise time to press for the Emancipation Proclamation after the victory at Antietam, the precise moment to pass the 14th Amendment after his re-election when everyone else was telling him to spend his political capital elsewhere. David, too, was both. He was a fox. David's creativeness, his political inventiveness, never ceases to astonish. Facing Goliath, he devises the one strategy that turns his opponent's size into a weakness. When running away from Saul, his only option is to take refuge among the Philistines, who are the enemies of Israel. And so, this great warrior feigns madness like Hamlet in order that the Philistines do not see him as a threat. And as we'll see in a moment, upon his establishment of the capital city of Jerusalem, he will show his far-sighted political vision. All this marks the statesman that is David as an innovative artist, as a surveyor who sees the potential pitfalls. But David's true north always remained the relationship between God and Israel, and David's desire to reflect this relationship throughout his life. A crafty fox he was, but David was also, if you will, a holy hedgehog. What he understood above all is the providential miracle of Jewish endurance. And because faith in providence was his true north, therefore, unlike many statesmen, David's greatness is highlighted not only in victory, but in failure and in defeat. When the people of Britain responded to Churchill's achievements in the war by following the war by ungratefully throwing him out of office and electing Clement Attlee, Churchill's wife Clementine famously commented, "Perhaps this is a blessing in disguise." And Churchill replied, "If so, it is very well disguised." But it is often in David's worst political defeats that we see his truest political greatness. Thus, after David's sinful relationship with Bathsheba and all the sins that flowed from it, God informs David that as punishment, a rebellion will rise against him from his own house. And indeed, David's son Absalom chases his father from Jerusalem. And as David descends in disgrace, he encounters Shimei, son of Gera, a man from the house of Saul, who sees David as a usurper. Shimei curses David. Those loyal to David wish to kill Shimei, but David says no. And later, when David returns to power, Shimei begs for forgiveness again. A Davidic loyalist wants Shimei killed, but again, David says, let him live. Because David realizes that all that has come upon him, including the shame of Shimei's curses, is due to the sin that he himself committed. As such, David, must respond even to those who hate him with humility, in the knowledge that these humiliations are providential punishment that is directed toward him. Now, many years later, when God has forgiven David's sin, David on his deathbed warns his son Solomon to act with political cunning toward Shimei, to remove the threat that Shimei poses to the Davidic family's future. In other words, David's political instinct remains, but he himself willingly accepts punishment because his faith in God's action reigns supreme. David is courageous and cunning, but as Sharansky put it, he was first and foremost humble before the Lord. John Lewis Gaddis argues that the truly excellent statesman, who is both fox and hedgehog, embodies F. Scott Fitzgerald's definition of a first-rate intelligence, which is, quote, the ability to hold two opposed ideas in the mind at the same time and still retain the ability to function. This is precisely who David is. The seemingly opposed actions that he holds, or ideas that he holds, are that of human action and divine providence, freedom and divine direction. David feels himself both subject and object, actor and acted upon. He plays political three-dimensional chess, and yet he remains in his own mind a pawn in the design of the Almighty, and feels, moreover, that it is a privilege to be a pawn held in God's heavenly hand. David engages in striking strategy, politics, military maneuvers, but making manifest the chosenness of Israel in history is always his true north. And it is David's relationship with Jerusalem that captures this complexity and reveals the essence of his greatness as a commander, as a leader, but also as a man of faith. Because Jerusalem rested on a mountain surrounded by two valleys, conquest of the site had seemed impossible. But as with Goliath, David sought the overlooked point of vulnerability. The Bible seems to hint that the water source of the city, referred to as the Tzinor, may have been the one opening in the city's fortifications through which David's warriors struck. And so David employs military genius here. But even more important than the strategic insight that allowed this operation to unfold is the political vision that attracted David to Jerusalem in the first place. David had been coronated king in Hebron, deep inside the territory of the tribe of Judah, the tribe to which he belonged. But David sought to move his throne to Jerusalem because, according to the book of Joshua, Jerusalem, alone among all the cities in Israel, had been apportioned to two tribes, his own tribe, Judah, and Benjamin, which was Saul's tribe. Thus, in replacing Saul and facing those who were angry about that event, David sought to create a capital that would unite Israel. And so Jerusalem reveals David's greatness, his military genius, and the fact that he was a political visionary. But then, after uniting Israel in Jerusalem, David sought to crown its highest point not with his own palace, but with a temple, a dwelling place of the divine for all eternity, which would thereby remind his subjects of the true source of their salvation in Jerusalem and throughout history. David's vision of Jerusalem reflects Jewish power, but also the predication of providence above power. And it's precisely for this reason that the task of building the temple, and it is precisely for this reason that the task of building the temple was given ultimately, not to David, but to his son Solomon instead. Had David concluded his career by building this edifice over the city he conquered, it would have inevitably been seen not as a tribute to God, but as a monument to his might. Because David was such a great warrior, people would have seen the temple as a tribute to himself. And therefore God tells him, no, you are a warrior, you have conquered the city, you have reflected your vision, and your dream of the temple is extraordinary. But your son Solomon will build it instead. God's seeming frustration of David's dream thus actually reinforces rather than diminishes David's greatness. Jerusalem through Solomon will now become known first and foremost not as a testament to Davidic might, but as the site of the temple, the dwelling place of the divine, the locus of David's dream, a symbol of God's role in Jewish history. And that is exactly as David would have wanted it. Jerusalem, in other words, is David. It reveals why he is our sublime statesman, our political actor par excellence. In his military exploits, he achieved fame. In his political vision, he exhibited greatness, but in his desire to reflect God's providence in Jewish history, David achieved immortality. And this, ladies and gentlemen, I think reveals why thousands of years since a descendant of David last sat on the throne of Israel, we still cannot speak of David without calling him king and associating him with statesmanship. David's legend endured because for the Jewish people to endure, they needed to see their history through David's eyes. Sharansky concludes his memoir by writing that as he left prison, the Soviets sought to withhold his book of the Psalms that had so sustained him in his cell. And in response, at the moment of freedom, when you might have thought Sharansky would have just said, okay, let's go, Sharansky drops down on the snow of the yard, refused to leave, and yelled at the top of his lungs, "Give me back my psalm book." The Soviets relented, and as they left the prison, Sharansky turned to the psalm that he had long planned to read upon his release. Psalm 30, written by David in preparation for the building of the house of God in Jerusalem. Mizmor Shir Chanukat Habayit LeDavid. A song of David at the dedication of a house. I extol thee, O Lord, for you have lifted me up, and not let my enemies rejoice over me. Now, Sharansky writes, as he reads David's dedication of the house, now I was reading these words en route to my own house in Jerusalem. David's descendants may not have reigned for well over 2,500 years, but more than any other political leader in history, he has impacted the way we see ourselves. It was David's ability to inspire his subjects, to remind them that God makes his miracles manifest in Jewish history and that Jerusalem forever reflects that profound fact. That is why Jews, dispersed all over the earth, never ceased to think of themselves as one people and never ceased looking to Jerusalem. Without Abraham, there'd be no Jewish family. Without Moses, there would be no Jewish faith. But it is David's vision that allowed us to persevere as a people, to believe that God's providence bound us together and that therefore the Jews would one day return to Jerusalem. And then they did indeed return. Thus, in early May of 1948, a man named David rose to declare Israel's independence, a reflection in part of the brilliant Jewish statesmanship that had brought the Jews to this moment. But was it only statesmanship? The Catholic historian Paul Johnson would later recall how watching the events of 48 unfold as a student in Oxford, with both the West and the Soviet blocs for the only time in history voting in the UN to allow this event to transpire, he, as a historian, saw a miracle in the making. But many Jews did not see it this way. And so, unlike the Psalms of David, king of Israel, the Declaration of Independence read by David Ben-Gurion, future Prime Minister of Israel, made no explicit mention of the divine, a concession to some of the Marxist members of the Zionist movement who refused to sign it otherwise. But then, almost 20 years later, Israel defeated its enemies over 6 short days in a series of astonishing military maneuvers worthy of King David himself. And as victorious soldiers gathered at the Western Wall, looking up at the locus of David's dreams, a photographer, also named David Rubinger, snapped a photo of 3 soldiers standing side by side, having no idea that in taking this picture he had just captured the most enduring image, the most enduring photograph in Jewish history. And the photo continues to inspire because it captures King David's vision in all its complexity. The photo recalls a brilliant conquest in Jerusalem in imitation of David long ago. The 3 paratroopers, diverse but unified, one Ashkenazi, one Sephardi, one Yemenite, embody the Jewish unity that David formed in Jerusalem long ago. But most of all, in the face of the central soldier, Yitzchak Yifat, we find the miracle of Jewish history, as he seemingly longingly looks up toward the Temple Mount, as David did long ago. The photograph is Jerusalem, it is Jewish history, and therefore it is David. The writer Yossi Klein Halevi has argued that the image's magic lies in its reflecting not merely majesty, but humility in the face of providence. Halevi writes, quote, "Perhaps the photograph continues to endure because it caught an even more profound moment in the history of Zionism. The return not only of Jewish identity, but of the Jewish God. Judaism," Halevi writes, "posited a daring idea that God's power and goodness would be revealed not only in the majesty of nature, but in the messiness of history, and even more improbably in Jewish history. The meaning of Jewish history, then, is that history has meaning. The return of the Jews to Jerusalem challenged, if not negated, the Nazi assault on the God of Israel. History had yielded the moment of consolation that generations of believing Jews had insisted against all logic must come. Once again," he writes, "it was possible for Jews to at least consider that the traditional Jewish view of God may be right after all." The reverence that many Jews felt toward the photograph of the paratroopers, writes Halevi, was the stunned realization seemingly reflected in Yitzchak Yifat's upturned face, that skeptical secularism may not be an adequate way of understanding the Jewish story, that God may be real after all. Yossi Klein Halevi reports that he went to see the photographer David Rubinger, a thoroughly secular Jew, and he told Rubinger his own religious interpretation of the picture. Rubinger originally disagreed, but then, he writes, Rubinger, quote, "looked up at the photograph hanging on his wall. For a moment it seemed as if his upturned face merged with those of the paratroopers. Yes," he acknowledged, "there is humility in their faces." Rubinger, he writes, was silent for a moment, and then he said, "When the state was created in 1948, we felt no sense of God at all. But here there was something." The photo taken by this man named David remains beloved in Jewish hearts because it best embodies the elaborate and exquisite vision of a man and monarch named David. A vision about peoplehood and politics, about Jerusalem and the Temple Mount, power and providence. The belief that God, as Halevi put it, would be revealed in the messiness of Jewish history. The belief, to paraphrase a young shepherd who stood before Saul so long ago, that the God who saved David from the lion and the bear, a God perhaps seemingly silent in certain decades in the 20th century, had somehow, suddenly, made himself known to Jewish history and to the world. We do not always feel God's presence as David constantly did. But the photograph's fame reveals that deep down in the recesses of our souls, Jews long to see the world through David's eyes. That is why, for Jews, there is no other name for king than David. That is why, long after he reigned in Jerusalem, David reigned still in Jewish hearts. That is why we, today, proudly proclaim that David Melech Yisrael Chai V'Kayam, David, King of Israel, lives still. Thank you very much.